Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of the Strength Coach Roundtable here on the Row Perfect UK Rowing Chat podcast channel. I am Will Ruth, strength coach and Row Perfect author of the ebook Rowing Stronger. And today I'm not joined by co-presenters Blake Gourlay and Joe DeLeo. They're still on hiatus, and I think we'll be back to our regular format within the next month or so. But I am joined by guest physical therapist Karen Calera and guest rowing coach Caitlin McLean. And today what we're going to do is talk about some common rowing coach frustrations and technical faults that we see in the boat, and then how Karen can help it from a physical therapy standpoint and how I can help it from a strength coach standpoint. So Karen, Caitlin, thanks for joining us. Karen, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, thank you, Will, for having me back. My name is Karen Calera. I'm a physical therapist based here in Seattle, and my business is Aligned and Balanced Rowing, and I help rowers from learn to row juniors to senior masters, and learn to row to elite level rowers across the country. And I've been working with rowers for almost exclusively for the last 5 years, 3 to 5 years, but definitely in the rowing community for many more years after that.
And Karen, the audience will recognize from the very popular episode 8 discussing the rib stress injuries. We got a lot of comments and messages and feedback after that episode, looking for more and more and more. So Karen is back by popular demand to talk about the physical therapy side of this today.
Thank you.
Caitlin, over to you for your intro.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me and Karen on your show. My name is Caitlin McLean, and I am a high school rowing coach for Holy Names Academy crew in Seattle, Washington. This is my 12th year coaching rowing after rowing myself in high school and college. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with the U19 national team on the women's side as an assistant coach at the high performance and the Canamex regatta level. So I'm here to soak in all the information and learn more and just be a part of this broader conversation that's been so valuable to me. So thanks again for having us and for doing what you do, Will.
Definitely. Caitlin, we met a few years ago through my website stuff, and I came down and did a strength training workshop with Caitlin and her assistant coaches, kind of teaching how to begin with strength training. And so it's been fun having talked to you for the last couple of years and kind of seeing your evolution from, open-minded to the strength training world into, okay, how do I learn more about this and get more resources into the hands of your athletes? So that's been fun. I think that's going to be, that's why we brought you on today, is to kind of represent that side of the rowing coach. And yeah, so I guess we could jump right into it. The common rowing coach frustration is, no matter how many times I suggest a technical rowing change to an athlete, certain athletes keep on making the error. So you can either kind of throw your hands up and say, screw it, they just don't get it. Or at that point, as many coaches have done, you can start to get help from a specialist to see if there's something physically preventing them from achieving that technique. So my goal this episode, and with the two of you joining me here, is to demonstrate how the physical therapy side and the strength coach side can work together with the rowing coach side to together improve rowing performance, athlete health and training efficacy. So that's kind of the goal for today. And so Caitlin, I'll let you kind of set the stage from your perspective as rowing coach now.
Yeah, well, I think for me as a junior coach, one of my goals is definitely, to have success, but more importantly to, be creating strong athletes who can continue the sport beyond the high school junior level, whether they keep rowing in college or at an elite level, or they decide to, pick up another venture. What we are really trying to do is teach life skills, create strong bodies. And so I think as I've grown as a coach, the PT and strength coaches have been a game changer for my understanding and for not only creating, hopefully fast boats, but also just healthy, strong athletes. So I met Karen about 5 years ago, and she was really the catalyst for us implementing a more intentional warm up and cool down for injury prevention. That was kind of the starting point. it was about that same time that I became familiar with functional movement screenings and kind of starting to build my awareness that the athletes can have, physical and biomechanical limitations that might prevent a technical change or ultimately open the athlete up to injury risk. So like having that knowledge really helped reinforce the importance of making time in practice for injury prevention routines. And I think it helps the athletes have some buy-in and take responsibility for their own individual, needs before, during, and after practice. So that really naturally progressed into a more holistic view on our strength training. And initially we just started revamping our lifts from sort of reps or weight focused to more of like, how do we correct weakness and imbalance in the athletes, especially with our younger population, novices and ninth graders, 10th graders. And so that, for the past few years really grew into a place where we were able to bring on a strength trainer. So we work with Michelle Clark from Sonic Athletics, and she just brings a wealth of knowledge in so many areas, obviously the lifting side and creating, a program with sport specific strength, as well as imbalance corrections, but also kind of drawing on that PT background of mobility and core, with a huge emphasis on proper form and breathing and bracing for load bearing activities, which is the weight room and on the water. And so, these areas really overlap with what I was hear from PTs, both Karen and then other PTs in the area. So, it can kind of seem overwhelming in the beginning to think about all these angles in addition to what we're trying to coach as rowing coaches. But I think at the end, it makes a lot of sense and they're ultimately very related. So, that's sort of, as I've learned more, like starting to look at, the coaching of the technique in a different way.
And so you've coached Holy Names for 12 years now, and you started with Karen and kind of this newer focus in your coaching within the last 5 years. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So for the first 7 years, kind of what were some of your, does this kind of day-to-day frustration of kind of coaching to the error without really being able to look at the physical side of the athlete? Was that kind of what your experience was?
Yeah. I think as many younger coaches or new coaches experience, they coach what they were coached, and they kind of start there. And so I think early on, I always loved strength training. I loved it as an athlete, and but I never thought about it from really how does it relate to the rowing stroke, or how does it, it was a long time before I realized that, how much imbalance is created in the sweep stroke and just what that can cause. And I was very fortunate not to have injuries as a rower, but certainly I see that there's a lot of every athlete's very individual, and and things like that come up. So I think early on, you're trying to coach what you see and what you know the ideal is. And some coaches really stick with those corrections. I think I was always a coach that kind of was like, well, they're not making that change, I need to move on to something else. And so you either stay frustrated or you move on. And, it's just a coping mechanism, right? So, yeah.
And there's a ton to fix, as you mentioned, it
Yes.
can feel overwhelming to look out at a boat or 2/8 or 3/8 or however many rowers you have and think, man, there's a lot that we could potentially be working on right now. And that can certainly feel overwhelming at first. One of the things you were just saying made me think of some research I read this week on actually trying to look at sport performance correlations with strength training. And I think because we always say it in the strength training world is, strength training improves sport performance. And it actually doesn't, strictly speaking, improve sport performance. What it does improve is sport relevant physical qualities that may improve performance. And I think that's a hard sell for a lot of coaches too, is like, I want to know that what we're doing right now will make better rowers right now. But if you can start to look at it from hey, what we're actually doing here is just making them stronger so that eventually they can become better rowers with these physical skills in place. And what the authors did find was that one of the main benefits was injury reduction. And injury reduction, again, not injury prevention, because you're really just reducing not only the number of injuries, but also the severity of the injury. And like you said, I think we should be able to go beyond I was fortunate to not get injured, and into, hey, we're actually doing stuff to try to proactively reduce injuries. And I like that goal of, not passing broken athletes on to the next level.
And, it's to add into that, Will, something that I like to say is it's the role of the strength coach to make the person the athlete. It's the role of the coach to make the athlete the rower.
Yeah.
And so we're just working on making the body better and move better so that they can actually do the sport to the best ability that that person can do.
Yep. Great point.
Yep.
Do you want to go ahead into, Karen, what you're kind of setting the stage for this episode?
Yeah, sure. So for me, it's been wonderful over the last several years to work with coaches like Caitlin, with Kamal Groom, John Parker, Sean Hall, all the coaches that I've worked with across the country, because it has really started to focus me on what I have been doing and moving more towards how does the body move and how does the body actually move in the rowing stroke, and how do we get it to do what it needs to do. Or what the coaches are asking to do, because I'll sit there and I'll listen to the coaching cues and what they need, and where they want the body to be at the catch, how they want the athlete to move through the stroke. And part of my thought process was, well, what if why aren't they getting it? Why is the athlete not getting it? And is it something within the body? Is it a structural issue? Is it an alignment issue? Is it a neuromuscular pattern? Is it something that just neurologically they just can't get that movement? So how do we teach them to move in the way that the coach is asking them to move? So I think this is where it becomes interesting, coming from a physical therapy background, in that we're because we deal with injuries, we're always trying to make that person better. Okay, so if the joint isn't moving, how do we make it move? And then if it's weak, if the system is weak, how do we make it stronger? But then how do we change the movement pattern? So, and this goes back to more like neurological, like stroke rehabilitation, pediatric rehabilitation. How do we teach that athlete to do the stroke? How do we engage the muscles in the correct way? How do we get the glutes to contract when they want them to contract? How do we get the scapula to work in order for them to suspend better so that they're not breaking their arms? So it's interesting to come from a different point of view, from kind of the injury point of view and working backwards, and then how do we bring that into the performance point of view?
Well, I think on the performance point of
standpoints.
view too, what you mentioned is meeting the rowing coach where they want the athlete to be. Even if you have your own idea of what the stroke looks like, every rowing coach has, someone wants the back to open up a little earlier here, someone wants a little bit more on the drive there, and each of those kind of has its own set of physical demands and injury risks that come along with it, benefits, trade-offs, the whole thing. So that's where the real unity of the strength coach and the physical therapist and the rowing coach can come into play. Is okay, tell me what you want, and then let's together figure out a way to make it happen.
Exactly, because every stroke, every stroke should look like, and it's not for me. I get asked this quite a bit. Is like, well, what is the best stroke?
I think we asked you that on your last episode with us.
Right. And it's not, I don't have an answer for that. It's like, well, what do you think? And because every boat also is going to be different, but then it's up to the strength coach, it's up to me to decide, or the physical therapist, to get that person there. Or if it's not possible, how can we make accommodations for that?
Mm-hmm.
Or what is the best stroke for that particular person? And I say that more along like the master's level, where bodies don't change that that well, or change at all. So so it depends on the level and the athlete, and the level of the athlete and the age of the athlete, which can determine what routes that we go in regards to into the stroke and how we make accommodations and changes. So, but bodies don't change that quickly. And the longer a habit has been in place, the longer that a certain posture has been in place, it takes a while for the athlete to make those changes. And I think that's something that coaches can have a better understanding of. But there are things that it's also something that the athlete just needs to work on day to day to make those changes.
And I think, Caitlin, you touched on that too, with a part of your focus is getting the responsibility and the tools into the athlete's hands to be able to troubleshoot and do some of this stuff on their own instead of waiting around for a coach to tell them, raise your handle at the catch kind of every single day and every single stroke.
Yeah, definitely. I've kind of come into this saying where I say we should treat PT the way we treat going to the dentist, where we like show up a couple times a year, we get exercises like flossing, and when we do it for the next 6 months and we come back and check in, and I kind of think like every single person, no matter if you're an athlete or not, you have some limitation in just biomechanically and how you're built. It's just you're not always putting yourself under load, but as athletes, like that's just something that needs to be a regular maintenance aspect.
And really, too, I mean, it's great that you're starting this with your, ninth grade athletes, because the more that you start early and start teaching them these tools and start helping them put their bodies in the right positions for the sport, the less work it is later on if they do continue rowing. You're not, with me working with college rowers here at Western, it's okay, now we're undoing 4 years or more of motor patterns. Karen, like you're saying, it takes the body a long time to change. The more strokes that they've done from a bad position, the harder it is to get them into a better position, and the more time that's going to take. Or even with you working with elite athletes, then you're looking at 8+ years of undoing.
Right. And a coach that wants them to make changes right now.
Yeah, right. Well, because we all want it faster.
Exactly.
And I think one of the cool things too, from you working with our Western rowers, you mentioned it briefly, like the accommodations that you make with their stroke. But if you could talk just a little bit more, because I'm sure it'll come up again with the physical accommodations that you actually make in the boat, because that's been the most interesting thing for me, watching everybody show up to practice with their fresh tools from you.
Their stuff. Yeah. So I look at it just like this comes to along the same lines as bike fits and orthotics or modifications to super feet for a person's foot, to make accommodations or to improve their running. So it's kind of on the same lines. Like, how do we make them fit better for the stroke or to their boat? Rigging is something that I am just now learning. I don't know a lot of, so I rely on working with the coaches regarding rigging, and that's mainly for if someone's really injured. Like, how do we offload? How can we offload the back a little bit more at the front end, or how can we do, something to ease the stress off the shoulder, at the catch. So I don't work with changing rigging in the boat that much. But what I do is look at how a person sits in the boat and or on the erg or on the RP, and how they look from that perspective. And hopefully that changes that correlates to what they look like in the boat. So during my assessment, I'll take different levels of seat pads and see where do they look more comfortable. How does this, if we raise them up or lower their foot stretchers, how does this look in the boat? Do they look more comfortable? Can they get up to the catch easier? Can they suspend a little bit better by changing just their positioning in the boat? If the leg drive isn't smooth, if their knees are splaying, if their knees are turning in, if they're too high off the foot stretcher with their heels and they're not loading the glutes or the legs as quickly as we'd like them to, how can we make accommodations or changes, like changing the angle of the foot stretcher, creating heel lifts, supporting the foot better by creating more arch support so that they're not pronating down? Those are all things that can affect a person's setup in the boat, or how effectively or efficiently that they move through the stroke. So in my set splits, I always have different materials with me to assess what they look like in the boat or on the erg in the beginning, and then if we make changes, how they look as we're making those changes. And those accommodations may be extreme in the beginning, but if it keeps them rowing more pain-free or more comfortable, then we'll start with that and then slowly decrease that over time. 3 weeks, make a change. Some of those changes we keep we may have to keep forever, depending on the athlete's body and age. And some of them we can reduce almost down to nothing, as long as that athlete is doing their work and they're rowing safely, free and injury free. So those are neat little tools and little things that can really help with not only injury prevention, but definitely with efficiency in the stroke as well.
Yep. And so I think I'll cut you off there before we start getting into too much of the specifics, because spoiler alert for the rest of the episode, all that stuff is going to come back as we start moving through our assessments. So, Caitlin, if you have anything to add, feel free to add it. Otherwise, let's go ahead and jump into the errors. Caitlin's going to play our kind of rowing coach with the frustrations, and then Karen's going to address any assessments or physical modifications that she might make from a physical therapy standpoint, and then I'll talk about how we can maybe strengthen the athlete to help them achieve the ideal rowing coach's technique.
Great.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so thinking about all the things that drive me crazy, that was an activity in and of itself. But I think just a very quick place to start is, a part of what I'm looking for in terms of where the athlete's body is coming into the catch and coming out of the catch is having the shoulder in front of the hip. We all know that's a power position. Look at any power sport and you see that position. So for me, it kind of, looking at is there a lack of body angle? Does an athlete have trouble establishing that body angle? We'll do body over pause all the time. They might get it, but then maybe they lose it. Coming into the catch, or just right off the catch, opening up too early, so that we're not maximizing that power position at the catch.
Yeah, this is a huge one. I think is the basis and foundation of a lot of technical faults. Actually, is can they get body over, and how? And if they are getting body over, how are they getting body over? For me, everything starts at that pelvis. Looking to see how the lumbopelvic region, how the hips are moving, and what does it look like at the catch and through the stroke. So at the catch, ideally, my marker is that we would want to see the pelvis. So not necessarily the lumbar spine, but the pelvis reach vertical to slightly anterior at the catch. And the reasoning for this is that then we know that they have good hip mobility to get that motion, which is really important for glute activation and then also the leg drive. But also it's what keeps the low back and the shoulder, actually the entire back, healthy. So if we can get the pelvis vertical or slightly anterior, then we know they have good hip mobility, and then B, we can prevent a lot of injuries that are happening. So the huge reason for lack of lumbopelvic motion is really lack of hip mobility. For your athletes, Caitlin, young women, what affects that the most is their posture. I can tell you now, we have to really work on young women's posture. Standing on one leg, standing in that sway back posture where their hips are tucked in, and their back is flat, but their hips are just tucked under. And that really shortens the posterior capsule. So the whole posterior capsule of that hip becomes short and tight, and they can't get body over. For young men, we have to manage their growth spurts. It's tightness, not only in that posterior capsule, but it's tightness in their hamstrings from fast growth spurts. They could be short. The hamstrings can be short as well. But those are the two big factors in young rowers that are limiting their ability to get body over. Another aspect that also creates body over, that angle, that pelvic angle, is also hip flexor strengthening or hip flexor strength. The main hip flexor, the iliopsoas, which is deep in the belly, that is a prime mover, one of the prime movers for the pelvis during the rowing stroke. it has to work. It works mainly eccentrically to control that pelvis through the swing. But if it's tight or short, it'll alter the low back, um, the lumbopelvic ability to actually rotate forward, but also just the posture in general. If it's short and tight, it can round out the back, which alters that lumbopelvic angle as well. So those are two areas to really look at in your athletes. And how I usually assess that is just in a standing, have hands on hips, have the athlete stand, squat, deep squat into compression. Now you want to look at them wide, like how they would normally squat, and then you'd want to look at the athlete narrow, like how are they going to be in the boat? Because if they're squatting, if they're doing a squat, a normal squat like they would do with a lift, that's not necessarily the same width they're going to be in the boat. So we need to look at how they're actually going to be squatting or moving or compressing in the boat. So I have them squat wide and have them squat narrow and see what's happening at that pelvis. Can they keep lumbopelvic neutral? Can they keep their back and from tucking in? So that's what I usually look for, is actually the butt tuck. Are they tucking in at the bottom, and where are they starting to tuck in? And look at that angle. So stop them where their butt starts to tuck. And where are they in relation to the stroke? Are they fully compressed? Are they 3/4 into the slide? I mean, where does that correlate? And then that can tell you, just for me, that's a big indicator of what the stroke is going to look like and how their back's going to look like in the stroke. So that's my first and foremost. That's the assessment I do at the beginning for all my athletes, because getting that lumbopelvic mobility and range of motion is the first thing that I always work on.
And you can always see too the athlete when they come into the weight room, the one that doesn't know how to manage that lumbopelvic relationship is off toes, or they will just kind of keep pushing the hips back and back and back because they're not
Right.
able to support themselves, kind of sitting down through,
Right.
In between the feet, basically, balanced weight 50-50 on the forefoot and the hind foot.
Right.
And a lot of times it's because they're so used to rowing and doing that same motion of, knees forward, really no hip hinge.
Exactly.
Caitlin,
They're compressing somewhere else. Mm-hmm.
yeah, exactly. Right. And so that was what I was going to talk about, was that if they're achieving that movement one way in the boat, then to take pressure off of one area, then they're putting pressure onto somewhere else. So
Exactly.
like that's the key in injury prevention or in injury reduction, is kind of getting them out of wherever you're putting that pressure now that's either inefficient for boat movement, as well as inefficient for your own physical movement, is a potential
Mm-hmm.
risk. A lot of what I do as strength coach is actually working against the rowing stroke. So if they're getting hundreds and thousands of reps in the rowing stroke every day, especially if they're moving, maybe even if they're moving in the best way possible in the rowing stroke, we still need to support the other exercise or the other parts of the body through other exercises. So in this case, especially if they are lacking of body angle, they're probably putting more of the rowing stroke through their back and less through the legs and posterior chain, the hamstrings and the glutes. So I would definitely start here with like a goblet squat, where you're holding the weight in front of you. It's a great way to, before going into the front squat or the back squat or any of the barbell variations, because the athlete can kind of, using a dumbbell or a kettlebell, holding it in front of them allows them to balance a little bit too. So what I'll actually have athletes who really struggle with this do like a pause squat. So they'll hold the dumbbell, the goblet squat, or the dumbbell, the kettlebell in front, the front rack position, squat down as deep as they can. Karen, same thing, like while maintaining that good pelvic positioning.
Yep.
And then pause there. And that the loaded stretch of strength training is, I think, a really underrated benefit, because you're basically same thing with like a Romanian deadlift, where you're pushing the hips back into the hip hinge. You're getting a lot of extra stretch in that area than you ordinarily would, kind of just by doing a regular static stretch. So I would say the goblet squat to get the squatting motion down, as well as to build up the leg muscles. Maybe the athlete's just not strong enough to take the pressure of the stroke through the legs. I mean, it depends on how you're rigged and what size boat you're rowing. But at the catch, you can be experiencing up to 150 pounds of force, more if the boat is stationary. So to ask an athlete to put that pressure down through their legs, primarily if they don't have the strength to, they're gonna fault and they're gonna find a way to do it somewhere else. Because that's one thing that the rowing stroke is great at, is finding how can we get you to survive this for, you know,
Exactly.
250 strokes of a race. Your body will find the way that it can do that
Right.
at all, and then
Right.
we need to go from there into how do we do this the most efficiently and the most healthily.
Yep. Yeah, the body will always go to the path of least
That's
resistance.
yep.
So whatever
Kayla,
it
what do you
takes.
think? Does that kind of match up with your experience? Are those things that you've been working out with your athletes, or is any of that new to you?
No, we definitely are doing some of those motions and really paying attention to how they move in the weight room and keeping that neutral spine. I think the challenge as a rowing coach, to be sort of devil's advocate, is, you know, the rowing boat is just so many variables, so unstable, that it's just, you know, it's like, just seems like it would take a lot to be able to get them to transfer that into the water. So, but you know, again, my, you know, short-term versus long-term goals is, you know, helps kind of keep that in perspective.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about expecting 14 or 15-year-olds to be able to do this, you know, the best possible within this academic year. But as you can see, even just in your time as high school coach, by the time they're 17 or 18, okay, now they actually do have enough experience to be able to learn, hey, I can do this, the same thing that we just did on land in my strength training session. I can start to see how the same motor pattern, the same strength starts to apply in the boat. And you're kind of building that physical literacy almost, you know, the idea of, hey, I know how my body moves and how I can get more out of this.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing just better overall strength and stability in these loaded positions coming into and out of our athletes that have kind of been in the strength training program longer, and also using their PT resources as well. And so I do think over time it works, and it transfers over for sure. But yeah, it's tricky because you want to actually have all three eyes on the athlete on the water. It's like, I want my PT's eyes, I want my strength coach's eyes, I want my eyes, so we can, you know, correct it immediately. But I think just the more we have these conversations, the more discussions and more knowledge out there, the more you know, we'll grow as coaches, even if we can't have those, you know, all those professionals in the launch at the same time.
Well, and I think there's some kind of overarching, you know, basic principles of strength training and some overarching basic principles of physical therapy that you can always put into place. And we'll make sure to come back around to talk about this at the end, as kind of like, here are your main, you know, 3 to 5 takeaways to do. And certainly mastering the basic human motions of the squat and the hinge is something you can work on, you know, with any level of athlete at any point, and expect it to either help them in injury reduction or in performance, either by, you know, adding more horsepower to their engine. Basically, if you can increase the amount of pressure they can put down with the legs, then that will eventually help them with the rowing stroke, or teaching them how to move their body, because the same hip hinge weight room is very similar to how you attain the same reach out of the bow with that nice body over motion. So those are certainly two kind of fundamental athletic movements that you can always teach, kind of regardless of the athlete.
Right. And the more times you practice it in as many different ways, the more the body becomes ingrained in it. So it's just hitting that same motion often.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Caitlin, anything else that you want to go over from kind of that phase of the stroke, or you want to pick another fresh frustration to move on to?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's multiple other iterations of that first one that Karen touched on and you touched on. So, but I think one that kind of starts crossing into maybe a different area is that kind of lunging into the catch, and maybe the reciprocal throwing the shoulder back afterwards. And maybe I think they're related, but I don't totally know. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how to reduce lunging motion at the catch, and sometimes also at the finish.
Yeah. So, and when you're saying the lunging motion at the finish, are you saying, or is it more that they're swinging upper body more, or they're slouching at the finish. Kind of what is I get. There's several different descriptions that I usually get. So
Yeah,
I'm just
I would say at the finish, what we see more is that just not a lot of body control around the back end.
yeah.
So sometimes it comes out as sort of a like kind of a jerky motion. Other people are, squeezing up into their shoulders and their neck, and then
Yes.
certainly the rounded, the slumpiness is the couch sitting is common.
Yeah. So again, it does absolutely relate to that lumbopelvic angle. Are they getting forward at the pelvis, which is allowing them to get forward in the upper body without having to pull forward at the shoulders? And so that may be also a bit what you were touching on with the first in our first portion of this talk, but that lunging at the forward, at the catch. When they can't get the body angle over from low, they're going to try to reach out through the shoulders. They're going to try to reach out to gain more length. And again, the body angle at the catch, if they're not getting good compression, either from the ankle, which is the second place that I look at, ankle or the hip, they're going to try to reach out through the spine, reach out through the shoulders in order to gain more length. Especially if they're trying to match someone who may be taller than they are or more flexible than they are in front of them. And so at the back end, so as the body is swinging, if we're seeing the back move, if we're seeing the shoulders, either if the athlete is grabbing at the shoulders through the stroke, if they are slouching at the back end, usually that is a product of lack of core support, and usually scapular strength as well. So at the front end, we're always checking for the hip. We're always checking for hip mobility. Can they reach through the hip? And then also, do they have the scapular stability at the front end just to hold proper A, suspension, and then B, hold their shoulders in socket so that they're keeping the weight out of their upper traps. If they're really weak in the low scapular stabilizers, they're really going to take the load up into their shoulders and really just shrug the shoulders or contract the shoulders. You'll see that kind of grabbing at the shoulders, or they'll break their arms early in order to take the load in the arms because they can't handle it in the core. The core is just not strong enough. And for me, when I talk about core, I'm usually actually talking about anywhere from the hip stabilizers, like the hip rotators, through the back and abdominal muscles, through the scapular stabilizers. So when you're seeing posture or technical faults, such as like the shoulders grabbing, they're reaching out through the shoulders, or they're grabbing at the shoulders, that it's usually a combination of mobility and weakness issues. If you're talking about a sweep rower, I also look at can they rotate their body around the spine, or are they, to get the length at the catch, or are they bending or side bending through the spine? Are they leaning into the rigor? Some coaches have that as a style, to lean into the rigor. So I work with the coaches on that, but look at how the athlete is gaining that. Now, as the body is swinging, through the body swing, initiating that swing, I think the strongest portion of the body and through the stroke is going to be that lumbopelvic region. So are they starting the body swing from low to high, where the pelvis is starting to rotate and the body's just following because it's a nice, stable, supported column? Or are they somewhat arching their back through the body swing because the pelvis can't move, or the psoas is too weak to move that pelvis, and they're arching their back and then throwing their shoulders back into the layback position? So if they're starting to slump at the finish, if they're losing that connection at the finish, that's usually lack of core support. So are their abdominals holding the column up, holding the rib cage, holding their torso up, while allowing for the psoas to move the pelvis or move the trunk through the swing, and allowing the lats and arms to do the work for the last part of the arm drive. Um, so we want to, assess that. Is their core strong enough at that for the second half of the stroke, from body vertical to the last half of the stroke to the finish? Is their core being supported by the proper muscles? So at the front end, so one way I assess scapular strength is simply just by looking at how their shoulders move or how their scapulas move as they're moving. So I start off with from behind, looking at the athlete's back, having them put having their hands at their sides. They put their hands on their hips, arms straight out to the side, and then overhead. And how is that scapula moving through that motion? Is it moving upwardly? Is it winging and tipping as they're moving with their arms at their side? What's their shoulder position? Is it rolled forward? Is it rolled forward and down? So those will give you clues on what's happening at the shoulder, what's tight, what's weak, just looking at that motion. For abdominal strength can be as simple as, double leg lower. So lying on their back, can they hold core stiff? Not necessarily back flat, but can the athlete hold their core stiff while they're lowering their legs towards the ground? So their legs are straight up at 90 degrees and they're slowly lowering to the ground. At what point do they lose that? Do they lose that ability to hold the core stiff? And so that will give you a rough idea of how well the psoas can move in lowering those legs, how strong they are, but also how well that the abdominals can support the core in that motion as well. So those are two assessments that I use to assess that. And then the rest of it is just looking at the stroke over and over again, looking at that athlete stroke over and over again. How are they getting the movement through the stroke, and having to create a movement retraining program to correct that.
Nice. I think this is one that, like you said, kind of keeps coming back to the stroke. And the first place that I would start with any athlete on this is, do they know what they're doing wrong? I think scapular motion is a really subtle motion until you're kind of taught how to feel those positions. And especially if you spend all day sitting at a desk or on a computer or whatever, it's really easy to think. Maybe you don't even know about, the position of retraction and depression, aka shoulders back and down. So that's one of the first things that I teach in the weight room, is how to put the scaps in that position. And I try to cue them, shoulder blades in the back pocket, right? That teaches them shoulders back and down. And I'll use exercises like the YWT raise just with body weight as part of our warm up, just to get them feeling that. Because a lot of times, the low and mid trap muscles, the low and middle sections of the trapezius are pretty small, especially compared to the upper trapezius. It's really easy to feel your upper traps working. Just shrug your shoulders up and down. It's much harder to feel the small, subtle motions of the low and middle trap. So I think that's almost something that an athlete needs to be taught as part of this physical literacy thing is, hey, here are your scapular muscles and here's how to feel them working. And then if you can teach them that in a nice controlled environment on land, then gradually they can start to feel that when they're actually in the boat. And then the other side of it is, do they know what they're doing wrong in the boat? And that's where film, I think, is really, really helpful to show the athlete, hey, you're throwing your shoulders forward every time you come out of bow. I think a lot of athletes just don't necessarily realize that. They're thinking about a lot of things when they're on the water. Okay, as you mentioned, there's a lot of environmental interference. The set's never the same. You get a little bit different, wind or some chop or whatever it is. It can change. There's a lot for the athlete to process, and scapular muscles, I think, could probably be pretty low on their overall priority list. So I think tuning them into that, and I've used it on the erg too, where I'll just film them erging and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. And they'll go, oh, wow, I had no idea I was doing that. So that can save you a lot of frustration, I think, just by teaching them the physical ability to do that and then showing them how it's coming up on the erg. Now, that might not necessarily fix it right away. And then I think from the strength coach perspective, that it's a problem of strengthening the wrong things as well as not strengthening the right things. And Caitlin, to pick on you a little bit, one of the first things that you and I discussed was throwing out that damn bench pull machine.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a perfect example.
It, so we didn't throw it out.
You passed it on to someone.
I would have burned it on a pyre. So I think that's just a perfect example of strengthening the wrong thing, because what you're teaching the athlete is with straight arms, as they would be at the catch, to bend their arms first, and to finish that motion most times with a shrug and coming from the upper traps. And it's really hard to teach them, no, actually, we want you to use less weight, and we want you to do fewer repetitions, and we want you to really focus on, pulling from the low and the middle. It's very, very difficult for the athlete to get the hang of that in that kind of environment. And so I think what ends up happening is you end up strengthening the athlete from a bad position at the catch, and then in the upper traps at the expense of the low and the middle traps. So what I'll do instead is like a bat wing row, and we'll post videos to all this stuff in the recap that we post on Row Perfect UK. But it's like basically a dumbbell bench row, and so that might sound hypocritical, but I use it, different implement, different coaching style, different focus for the athlete to really focus on learning to keep the shoulder blades back and down, and then to generate force from that position, and teaching them to pull from the elbows, not from the hands. It's an internal cue, but I think that it helps to get them out of that early arm break mindset. And so that's how we can start to kind of strengthen the right things, in addition to stuff like the body weight, the YWT raises, face pulls, band pull aparts, all pretty low investment equipment, because the scapular muscles are pretty small, and it doesn't take much to be able to put kind of a lot of, sorry, that's the dog there making his guest appearance. It doesn't take much to make the scapular muscles work really hard.
Can I just ask a question, potentially off topic, but what would your responses be as you're having an athlete try to get into that scapular back and down position if they're like super uncomfortable? So I have a couple of kids that are just like stiff in that upper body. And I try to cue it, and I try to, we actually tried your exercise, Will, where you put your, hands behind your head and you practice being at the release and moving up the recovery. And, I guess, do you force that? Like, do you keep coaching toward that, even though it's uncomfortable or potentially painful for that athlete? Or do you try to include more of these exercises and hope that they make a change, or they
I think the first rule of being a strength coach is do no harm, right? Because if the rowing coach finds out that you forced an athlete into a certain position or whatever, and now they can't row the next morning, they're going to be pretty upset with you. So force no, putting them in positions that are painful or very uncomfortable, definitely not. What Caitlin's referring to, just for the audience's benefit, is that hands behind the head. All these drills have 1,000 different names. So you sit at the finish, either on an erg ideally or in a boat, and put your hands behind your head, and then find your right finish position. And it's not as simple as just popping your hands behind your head, because you have to have the right position to go along with that. So I wrote an article available on my website, which is rowingstronger.com, basically breaking down that drill from the strength coach's perspective for, if we see this restriction or this point of discomfort, then here's what we might be looking at. And Caitlin, what a lot of that comes down to is pairing the mobility stuff that Karen was talking about with the strength training stuff. So I think continue to put them in basically the simplest exercise that they can do that doesn't cause them any pain or discomfort. So like the YWT raise is often hard for people, so I'll use a prone YWT raise, and I've got a video for that too, where they're lying down on a bench, or you can even do it lying down on the floor, and then you're really just focusing on very small movements. But if the athlete can't even get into that position of supported thoracic extension, basically, then what you're looking at is doing
a lot of mobility exercises.
That's right. So the foam rolling, the stretching, the targeted work, and all that is really best to have the eyes of a qualified physical therapist like Karen actually look at and diagnose, hey, here's specifically what's going on. But there's a lot of general mobility stuff that you can do that will still be helpful to achieving those positions.
And what I find is usually I went away from starting off with just doing thoracic extension, trying to get them to bend backwards at first and foremost. even if they're not painful. So I usually start off with thoracic rotation mobility exercises like pigeon stretch with thoracic rotation, or where they're or the classic thoracic rotation mobilization exercise where they start off in quadruped, drop their hips down to their heels, one hand behind their head, and they're rotating to the side. I find thoracic rotation is much easier and less painful for the athletes to work on first for mobility, and that extension will come with that. Because with thoracic rotation, there's a component of extension in that motion, and you can also turn that into a slight isometric. You can turn that into an isometric exercise for the low trap and mid trap as well. As they're rotating, they can start squeezing that shoulder blade around, back and around with that exercise. So I usually start off rotation first rather than extension in the beginning, especially if they're painful.
Great point. And that's also kind of an overarching strength training and physical therapy thing that you could do too. Pretty much everybody needs more thoracic care. So
yes.
whether that's foam rolling, whether that's specific, lacrosse ball, tennis ball, work on specific muscles. In rowing, you're just wrenching on those muscles all the time through every stroke. So if nothing else, for the athletes who are functional, who don't have a mobility restriction, it should at least feel good. So it's rarely something that athletes are really going to complain about, and it's definitely something you can kind of just roll the foam rollers out and have them do for 5 or 10 minutes. And be able to see benefit across a wide range of athletes.
Great. That's super helpful.
Yeah. I think the challenge for you, Caitlin, is that you have such a large team that it's hard to have everyone on an individual program. So it's almost as if you just have to have everyone, just realize that probably 85% of your athletes have these similar dysfunctions, and it's good for everyone to work on.
Yeah, I think that was super helpful when you were working with us, and we kind of were able to have some screenings for the individual athletes and then be able to group them. And I think we're not there yet, but I think a longer term goal will be to really have these groups of, dysfunctions or what have you, that, they have their dysfunctional group and they work on their dysfunctions.
Right.
That's I'm going to get on that right away.
That's a good way of putting it.
Let's go ahead into our last technical fault then, and then kind of wrap things up with a discussion of what are some of those overarching things that you can incorporate right away in your rowing program.
Yeah, I think you're referring to kind of, and we've touched on it a little bit, but this idea that we have athletes who, no matter how many ways we say it, break their arms off the catch or bend their elbows too soon. And I'm always just like going for the exaggeration, like just, you don't have, I told the kid the other day, imagine I'm going to remove your elbow, surgically remove your elbow, like any gory way. And finally she did stop breaking her arm. But it still comes back a little bit. So I think, and it's interesting, I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say about that and how we can, it seems so simple to me. It's like, look at your arm. It's the elbow's broken. Like, what is it that you do not understand about this?
Yeah. So, very, very common problem. And I see this at all levels. I think a big reason for the arms breaking early is that they're trying to feel the load in the arms because they can't feel the load in their scapulas and in their back. And it could be that for some of my athletes, their legs are so much stronger than their core, and the transfer of leg power to the core is too much. So they're breaking their arms to take it into their biceps, which are a lot stronger, which they can stabilize a lot better. For athletes that are younger, I think, again, it's just core weakness, especially in that scapular area. They just can't handle the pressure or can't handle that stress across the scapula, across the upper back, mid to upper back, in order to transfer the load effectively to the lat. So they're holding it into the biceps because that's what can stabilize and stabilize that upper body. So again, we're looking at,
yeah, that kind of goes with your, the body's going to find the path of least resistance thing. That if they can't distribute the force, because if you do have 150 pounds of force at the catch, then that's 150 pounds of force that has to go through the hands, through the scaps, through the torso, then to the legs to actually put the pressure down. And so if there's a weakness at any of those points, then there's going to be a leak there. That's where you're going to see the fault, is where the athlete can't sustain that force. Yeah. I think, Caitlin, that kind of is maybe what you're seeing, is the athlete can hold it together for 10 or 15 strokes, but then, man, the scaps are fatigued. The torso is fatigued. It's like, like I'm super tired. My muscles are exhausted. So then you start going back to the bicep stroke, because they're too worn out to basically continue doing the stroke the right way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I like that analogy of, this idea that there's a leak in the system. That's a cool way to look at it. I guess one of the things I would ask as a follow-up is, I've certainly heard that concept in a different way. And sometimes I'll actually tell the kids, back off on the legs and push at, or press at I kind of call it the highest starting value that you think your whole body can sustain. And obviously it's sort of not ideal to tell them, back off on the legs or what have you, but I don't know if that, is that a good way to address it in the short term, so that they're not injuring some other area, and then in the weight room and on land really working on the strength? Or how do you see that working in practice?
I think it's definitely a beneficial approach to take, and I think kind of splitting it into phases of the year is a really good way to look at that too. So maybe you don't do that right now because you're racing, next weekend or the weekend after that, and then you've got regionals coming up, and kind of we're in the you need to row for performance kind of phase. But in the fall or in the winter, when you're doing a lot of erging and it's all very kind of controllable, that's a really good time to say, okay, basically what you're saying is, if I can't drive safely at 90 miles an hour, then I need to drive safely at 60 miles an hour, right? So that's not a very unusual concept, to kind of say, all right, let's stay within your technical limits, rather than within your kind of absolute muscular limit. And then that also gives you the time to say, okay, we're going to make up for, all the extra pressure or whatever that you're not putting into your rowing stroke right now. We can make that up with extra work in the weight room in a way that's going to continue to shore up those weaknesses, and then build you into a much better rower come, the next spring season or the next competitive cycle, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Karen, kind of same perspective from you?
Yeah,
or?
I definitely would agree. I definitely agree.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Caitlin, does that sound like something that would work in practice?
Yeah, that's definitely helpful, and kind of ties into that concept of periodization in the weight room and elsewhere. So yeah, and that car analogy is also good. I will be borrowing that from
every coach steals. The rule is that you give credit the first time. The first 2 times you use it, you give credit, and then after that, it's public domain, and anybody can steal it without having to.
So is that an original, Will, or did you borrow that?
No, I stole that, but I've said it enough times now to where I'm out of the copyright phase. Yeah.
Nice.
That's great.
So yeah, I guess let's try to recap this with, if you are a rowing coach or a rower, and this is kind of new stuff to you, then Karen, let's try to figure out here, what are like the top 3 to 5 things that we would have you start to work on. Do you have any in mind, or should I start?
Yeah, so my first one is hip mobility, because that sets up the pelvis for being at better positions, and then everything above that. So if you find that your athlete is lunging at the catch, pulling out through the shoulders, just doesn't have good, the curve in their spine through the stroke is much lower than we want it, hip mobility is the first thing to start off with. So the assessment would be, look at the deep squat. Are you tucking your butt under? It's probably the easiest one to assess. Look at it wide and look at it narrow. And then 2 exercises that I would do that require no equipment is, one is called the deep ape reach, and it's, if you Google it, you can find it. But basically, you're just in that deep squat, and you're reaching forward through the legs, bringing the knees wide, and then you're sitting up straight, bringing the knees narrow. So we're really massaging that posterior hip capsule that gets tight on everyone. And then the next exercise, so deep ape reach, number 1. Number 2 would be shin box, where you're sitting in what I call bear sit, and you just drop your knees 90-90 to the right, rotating them to the right, both of them, and then rotating them to the left. And so you're working on internal and external rotation of the hips, and again, massaging that posterior capsule, really mobilizing that posterior capsule and hopefully opening them up.
And I know that's one that we had video of from your last episode, so I'll make sure to post that link to your flow in the recap for this one too.
Yeah, so that's I think that's really key. And with the deep ape reach too, you're getting some aspect of ankle mobilization as well. So that's why I also like that exercise. If you have a tendency towards tight ankles, which can affect your squat and affect your ability to compress at the catch, that exercise will work on that. The next exercise I think is really key is the pigeon stretch with thoracic rotation. So now we're stretching that posterior hip capsule in pigeon stretch, but now we're also working on thoracic mobility at the same time while locking out the lumbar spine. You can add in some isometric scapular work to add in some of that low trap work. Not quite as effective, but you get a little bit of it. So I think it's a good bang for your buck on that exercise. But thoracic mobility is really key for good proper posture in the rowing stroke, and also gaining a little bit better thoracic mobility. And the next exercise that I really like would probably be in my top 4 would be plank to down dog. So plank to down dog, we're getting a stretch of that posterior chain all the way from the calf to the upper back. We're working on proper hip hinge, making sure you're bending at the hip, you're not bending at the low back. And then we're getting some scapular strengthening and some core strengthening in that exercise as well. So for me, those would be like my top 4 exercises to do. But first and foremost, that squat assessment I think is really key for everyone.
Nice. And I think kind of tagging onto that with the bang for your buck concept is we work a lot of this in to a really good land warm up for rowing. So it really doesn't require an extra session, but maybe, 10, maybe 15 minutes if you include like the little slight amount of cardio warm up just to get kind of the core temperature elevated. You can work a lot of this movement prep in a way that most coaches don't. You kind of do the, forward leg swings and stuff like that, but you can actually start to work in some of this muscular activation stuff too.
Yes.
And then really sneak it into the training in a way that not only benefits them in rowing, but also benefits them just from the amount of just reps of actually doing it. So that would be my first one, is to make sure that you've got a good full body warm up that you do on land, at least before strength training, if not before rowing training sessions too. Then on top of that is just kind of mastering the basic fundamental human motions. So if you're looking at the squat, can you do a bodyweight squat or a goblet squat just to start the loading of it? Then if we can get into the hip hinge motion, you can even just teach that unloaded at first, and then get into loading it from there with stuff like the Romanian deadlift, dumbbell or kettlebell. Then can we get into good basically pushing? So like the push-up is just a really easy place to start. And again, you can use it in a warm-up, or if your athletes are advanced enough, then you can start to load that in other ways. But that's teaching scapular stability as well, and then developing muscles that the rowing stroke often neglects. Then pulling. So let's get out of the bench pulls and into more effective, more sport specific, more kind of holistic athletic pulling, stuff like inverted bodyweight rows, or even stuff, more of the scapular side of things like the bat wing rows, and then your basic core strengthening. So I think that's a really easy place if you just start with the simplest strength training workout possible, cover those 5 movement categories, do the mobility, do the warm-ups, and you will be on the path to achieving a higher level of athleticism that will hopefully eventually make you a better rower.
It will make you a better rower.
I believe so.
Yes.
Caitlin, anything you want to add before we sign off here?
No, I think just to any coaches that are listening, I would just encourage everyone to be open-minded to some of these other areas that we don't always think of immediately or recognize that we can, include more. I think rowing coaches in general, we are jacks of all trades. We do so many different things. I think this will only enhance that, but also if you can sort of outsource some of it and create some partnerships. And, obviously it's challenging to maybe have a PT on staff, which I know some programs do, or have a strength coach on staff. Even just bringing some of those folks in for day workshops a couple times a year has certainly enhanced my knowledge, has created my more knowledgeable coaching staff, even athletes. So I just can't, thank you all enough for your interest in rowing and making that part of what you talk about, but just being willing to share your knowledge with each other and learn. So thank you to Will and Karen for sure.
Yeah, and I think invite the strength coach out with you. A lot of us want to learn, new things, and that was how Karen started too. Was, hey, sure, I'll jump in here and start to learn this. And I think that can really help for coaches to start to see things actually on the water in practice too, and then start to build that unity between the fields.
Yep, I agree.
Cool. Well, thank you both so much for being on. This was a great guest episode, and to the audience, as usual, I'll be posting the recap on Row Perfect UK afterwards with any additional notes and videos and anything else that we want you to kind of be able to take away from this episode. And then, as always, feel free to ask any questions either in the comments section of this or on the blog or on Facebook or really any social media platform that you can get your hands on. We will try to find a way to answer your questions. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.